Okay, so Vanessa and I just want to begin this workshop by introducing ourselves and telling you a little bit about our background with composting. So I will start. My name is Claudia Urdanivia, and I am fascinated with everything to do with compost. I just want to give a word of gratitude to BK Raw in Brooklyn, because it is from them that I really gained this sense of love for composting and how community members could make a great change in reducing waste just by taking these small actions. So I learned a lot from them, and I've been composting over the last couple of years in the garden and also at home with my worms. These are my new pets, which I'll tell you about in a little bit, but I'm learning all the time. And I actually learned a lot from Vanessa Ventola, who's going to introduce herself now.
Thanks very much, Claudia. My name is Vanessa Ventola. I'm an outreach coordinator for Queens and Bushwick with GreenThumb. I also want to say a word of gratitude. My word of gratitude is to Two Coves Community Garden, which is where the Western Queens Compost Initiative was started up by an amazing group of people. I worked with them about 10 years, and compost has been my passion since then. I can say that I've brought couple of hundred worm bins into the world, and hopefully we'll get, see there's 87 people on right now, so maybe a few dozen more today as well.
Thanks, Vanessa. And of course, I forgot to tell you all what I do at GreenThumb. I'm the project coordinator, so I have the pleasure of working with my amazing colleague, Mara Gittleman, and we coordinate workshops and all of this fun educational programming for you guys. So now we can actually start. And what I'm going to begin with is just telling you about what we're going to share today. And we're going to tell you everything that you need to start your vermicomposting, including the supplies that you need, how to get the worms, troubleshooting, and more. So that's our agenda for today. It's relatively easy. You could actually do this tutorial in about 10 minutes, but we're going to guide you through it over the next 40 or 30 minutes and then leave some time for questions and troubleshooting. So first of all, what is vermicomposting? It's also known as worm composting. It's a process of feeding worms their food scraps to reduce waste and make nutrient-rich compost. And so for those of you who are not familiar with compost, that is decomposed organic matter with the help of microbes and other organisms. So vermicomposting is really easy to do at home. You don't need a lot of equipment or time. It's very easy, and it's also very, very family friendly. So if you want to start that with kids, it's definitely a great project. So the basic process is that first of all, you need to make a bin where worms can live. You regularly feed them food scraps such as any vegetable scraps, veggie tops, also coffee grounds. And then the worms do the rest of the magic. Basically, through their digestion process, they transform this food into worm casting compost, or also known as worm poop. Compost is really great for using in your potted plants because it adds a lot of nutrients, helps to keep the soil moist, and also provides aeration. Worms also make really great pets, especially for folks like me who live in a small New York City apartment and are not able to have pets. You definitely can check up on them all the time. You can't take them out for walks, of course, but you can have them there in little small spaces to check up on them. So now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa so she can get us started on what supplies you need.
Awesome. And I'm just going to give it a second for the video to change over to me here so that you can all see what I'm showing you. Well, while we change who's pinned to the screen here, I'm going to start to describe some of the items that you'll need to start your first worm bin. So if you've never made a worm bin before, some things you're going to need is something to keep your worms in. You're going to need something to, preferably a spray bottle to help moisten your worm bin. Oh, perfect. We're on. You're going to need something to make some holes for airflow in your worm bin, and you're also going to need worms and some food scraps and a little bit of bedding for your worms. So I'm going to show you the items that I have prepared to make our worm bin today. So first, a worm bin. I like to use a clear plastic bin. I find that it's very easy to see how your worms are digesting your food and making compost for you. You can definitely get creative, reuse something that you have at home. I've seen a couple of great worm bins made in old aquariums. That works just fine. But if you're just starting out, this might be something that you already have at home that you might not be using, and it's very easy to work with. So this bin is about 16 quarts. I'd say this is a good size to start out with. It's not too big, it's not too small. If you do want to go smaller, I'm going to say no more than half the size, no smaller than half the size of this bin. It's just about how much space worms need to move around. And then what we're going to do is learn about how to make some airflow in this, but I'll just show you the bin for now. So again, just regular plastic bin. You're going to need some newspaper to make some bedding. Worms, they're not too picky. They don't care what newspaper you read. Whatever you're reading at home, the newspaper works just fine. If you don't get the newspaper, you can always pick up an AM New York from the sidewalk as do a little bit of cleanup for your neighborhood. And Claudia is going to show you some other items that you can use as bedding as well. And then for making holes in our bin, today I'm going to use a drill. I find that is a really easy way to do it and fast as well. And you could also use a nail with a hammer. You could use a sharp knife, just please be careful. If you are using a drill, I'll just show you the drill bit is not very big that I'm using. It's about 1/4 of an inch. You don't want to go too much bigger than that because you don't want your worms to be able to get out of the hole. So a spray bottle. You want to keep your worms moist during the whole time that they're with you, and especially those very first few days when you're getting them settled, because they're going to be pretty dehydrated when they arrive. All right, you get dehydrated when you travel, so do your worms. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to actually set up your worm bin. So Claudia has a worm bin that is already set up and the worms are happy. She's going to show that to you afterwards. But if you're not at that stage yet, how do you make it? So worms, they need 4 things to survive. They're very similar to us in some ways. They need shelter, they need air, they need food, and they need water. So we want to make sure we have everything that they need in their happy little environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my clear plastic bin in this case, and I'm going to use my drill. I'm not going to make all the drill holes with you on camera because it is very loud, but I'm going to make some holes in the lid and around the top of the bin. You could do it on the top of the sides. If you've ever looked into some different worm bin tutorials, a lot of them will actually recommend that you make some holes at the bottom to improve drainage. Personally, I don't like to do that because I find that it will leak a tiny bit, and I find it's a little unnecessarily messy. But if you do ever start to have a lot of moisture accumulation in your bin and want to experiment with that, you can. Just make sure you, of course, put a tray underneath your bin if you're going to make that decision. So if you are using one of these plastic bins and using a drill, just be pretty gentle. You can crack the lid if you are a little bit too aggressive. As I said, it's very loud. So I'll show you how many I made in advance. We do this like a cooking show where many things are pre-made. So I've made, you can see the light coming through, a whole bunch of little holes in here, probably about 50 on the top. And I've also gone ahead and put some holes along the tops of my bin. This is just to increase airflow. You can always add more holes if you need to, if you notice that your bin is staying a little bit too moist. You don't want to make anything, you don't want big cracks or anything like that. One thing, if you are using the plastic bins, is that the drill tends to make this little, I don't think you can see it, but little plastic snow. So you just want to make sure that any of those little plastic brines are wiped out of your bin before you get your worms settled. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is create a little bit of additional shelter so we have some air. Worms, they typically live in the very top layer, or the worms we're using, which are called red wigglers. They're a composting worm. They typically live in the very top layers of the soil, what we would call the O horizon. So where all the organic material is, like plant roots and debris that they're breaking down. So we want to kind of mimic their habitat. So fortunately, the red wiggler worm, this is kind of silly, but some worms, they like to travel like this, and some they like to travel like this. Red wiggler worms, they like to travel like this. So they're very well suited for just being in a bin because they're not too It's not too unnatural for them to move back and forth horizontally, but we're going to give them some shredded newspaper to kind of mimic what that topsoil layer would feel like so that they're not quite so uncomfortable, I guess, if worms can be uncomfortable. And we're also going to make sure to moisten that newspaper. So we want to take the guesswork out of this, make it easy for you. I'll tell you my secret newspaper shredding tip. You might be very tempted to open up your New York Times and go the short way. For some reason, shredding newspaper, way easier the long way. I know this is silly, but you know, when you make a couple of hundred worm bins, it comes in handy in life. So you're going to shred up some newspaper. I'm making about 1-inch strips. It's kind of up to you. I don't know that the worms have a preference, but I find that this works well, and it's easy to remember that as a tip. And of course, pre-shredded some paper for us so that we don't have to listen to that. So once you have your shredded paper, what you're going to do is kind of take it and crumble it into your bin. So I'm just kind of smushing it up, keeping it pretty fluffy. Okay, and I'm just kind of making little clumps. Your worms, as I said, they are going to be a little bit dehydrated, so you want to make sure to make your newspaper pretty moist. It's going to kind of compress as it gets a little bit wet, but once you are finished spraying, you want at least maybe about half your bin to be full of this loose, moist newspaper. So a spray bottle here. And how wet is wet enough? You want your newspaper to be about as wet as a raw sponge. So this is a good example. I know you can't see too well, but if I squeeze this as hard as I can, you shouldn't have any water dripping out, but your hand should feel pretty moist. That's a good amount of water in your newspaper. And then I personally like to put a little bit of dry newspaper on top of that. The reason being is that worms, they are actually a little bit sensitive to light. So I've chosen a clear bin, again, because I find that it's nice, especially for educational purposes, to see the worms and, you know, the food scraps that they're decomposing. But worms are sensitive to light. They don't have any eyes, but they are still photosensitive. This is, you know, if you're a worm and you're seeing daylight, it means that you might be in danger because you're on the surface. So a little bit of extra newspaper will help them to be a little bit more settled and prevent light from getting through them. So I'm going to add a little bit of dry newspaper on top. This will also help to regulate moisture in your bin. The food scraps that you feed your worms tend to be very moist, so you don't want it to get too soggy in there. This first time you make your bin, you're going to add that moist newspaper, but once you're caring for it, typically you'll be adding dry newspaper because the food scraps will be added moisture. Okay, so after that, your habitat's pretty much set up. It's pretty easy. You're going to get your worms and you're going to get some food scraps. So worms, Claudia's going to tell you a lot more about her experience with getting worms and getting them settled. But worms, when you put them in the bin for the first time, you're going to move the newspaper aside. The worms are going to go down here at the bottom along with some food scraps, and you're going to just gently cover them up. You're going to put your lid on. And you're going to keep your worms somewhere that is just in same temperatures that you're comfortable in, as well as preferably somewhere that's brightly lit for the first few days. Claudia will tell you more about that as well. If you're looking to get worms, there are a couple of options. The worms you're going to see today came from Uncle Jim's wormfarm.com, but I'd also encourage you to reach out to some local sources for worms, like the Lower East Side Ecology Center, which is where I got my very first worm bin. So I'm going to turn it over to Claudia now, who's going to show you her worm bin and tell you all about caring for it.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay, so should I wait for the video to pin onto me? Can you guys see me? Yeah, okay, great. So before I go into telling you a little bit about my experience, I just wanted to share some really cool facts about worms and how awesome they are. People might know this from elementary school or other places that you've heard, but did people know, for example, that they have 5 hearts? They also have male and female reproductive organs. Their lifespan is about a year, and one mature worm can give birth to up to 100 worms per year. They also eat about half of their body weight each day. So now for show and tell about my worm bin. This is their home, their permanent home, a container just like Vanessa showed you guys. But I have also placed them here for a little show and tell in this little takeout container. I don't know if you could, they're kind of hiding right now. Oh, I don't know if you guys could see them anywhere here. Well, I can't really pin it too well on this camera, but they're over here crawling around eating some food. And this is their little mesh blanket, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. It came in the package that I ordered them from. Okay, so as Vanessa said, it's a good idea to keep your worms in a well-lit space. I got my worms from somewhere called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, but before I got them from Lower East Side Ecology Center. That was my first iteration of trying worms, and they actually lived to be about 8 months, but unfortunately they became compost themselves. It's an experience that happens with everybody. Sometimes, you know, you just like with gardening, you start, you try it out, it's trial and error, and now I've learned a lot more about worms. So this is the second time around that I am caring for them. So I ordered my worms from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, and I ordered a kit that came with worm food. I don't know, it's just some dried stuff, but you could honestly feed them many different things, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically, I got them set up a few weeks back, and just like Vanessa's procedure that she just explained, I put some some newspaper, but I didn't have enough newspaper. So actually I used some old bills that I had I don't know why I still have them actually. I was getting ready to shred them. So I just, you know, shredded them up and put them in there. I added some water, I added the worms, and then I put them on top of my refrigerator and left the light on so that they won't escape. But inevitably they do escape a little bit. And the reason for that is because I chose a different method to provide air for them. And this is a tip that I learned from my colleague, Eric Toman, who's an outreach coordinator at GreenThumb and also a compost educator. He told me that I should cut a rectangle in the top of the lid and then just add some mesh on the top. And this provides for much greater airflow for the worms. You can also do the drill one, which I recommend, but if you have them in a space like a closet that where the door is closed all day and where there's not a lot of airflow, this also helps them to breathe a little bit easier. So either one of the methods will work. At first, they will escape. That's just what happens because, again, like Vanessa said, they're a little bit dehydrated. They're getting adjusted to their new home. So having them in a place where they get some light for maybe 2 to 3 days will be fine. And then they will settle into their new home. I've had mine, I guess, for 2 weeks now, maybe less, I don't know, but they've settled in. I haven't found any more worms escaping for the time being. So I think, I know Amber's going to tell us the questions, but I actually peeked and saw one question. Is there soil in this bin? Mine actually came in that kit that I ordered. The worms came with something called coconut coir, which is sort of like a potting mix. You can also use that as bedding for them, but the only thing is that it dries out a lot faster than the newspaper or paper. So you definitely, if you're going to use the coconut coir as a bedding, you want to check it every day and just make sure that it's moist enough. You do not want to let anything here dry out because it will dehydrate the worms. However, if you're putting in food, fresh food like parsley, cilantro, that has a lot of water content, so that's going to keep it moist as well. We'll go over that in a little bit about when we go over the troubleshooting tips. But okay, so coconut coir, we talked about that. Now how to feed the worms. So believe it or not, worms they can't eat everything. They also have some dietary restrictions. They can eat a lot of things, but not some things. So I'll tell you about that now. So again, just want to reiterate that they do eat a lot, especially depending on the number of worms you have. They eat about half of their body weight every day. So if you have 1,000 worms, that's about 1 pound. So they eat about half a pound of food scraps every day. I don't have that many. I have about 100 that I started out with. They came in a little container in a little bag with a little bit of potting mix, and then now they're settling in, but they'll be able to reproduce through time and as they eat more and are well cared for. So worms love to eat veggie scraps. They don't have any teeth, so don't put like a whole banana in there. They're not going to eat that. You have to have small pieces of food scraps and chop it up for them. So I mentioned veggie scraps, not necessarily fruit scraps. You can give them fruit scraps, but you might end up with the problem of having fruit flies. I experienced that issue, and it was something I definitely had to work through. So I recommend if you are going to give them fruit scraps, like let's say a banana peel, they do like that, but you might want to put that in the freezer first, and then after a few days, then you can put it in their bin. Don't put it directly after you've eaten it, because then you might have a fruit fly problem that might be difficult to troubleshoot. Okay, so the other thing they do not like is citrus. Don't give them citrus. They're just not able to eat that. Other things they don't like are meat and dairy products. They also breathe through their skin, so be sure to not give them anything that's oily. And then beyond that, that's really their restrictions, and you can experiment with what they like to eat. Having a worm bin is really more like an art than a science. It's a lot of trial and error, just like with gardening or anything that is hands-on that you learn through time. So what I feed them, I have their little food here. I have a little Tupperware for them. This I cook with a lot of herbs, so I have a lot of old parsley and cilantro here. Sometimes I give them apples, but again, I freeze those first. And I add food every couple days, but I actually do check up on them every day just to make sure, again, they're not escaping and that they're properly moist. Okay, so some troubleshooting tips. If you start to see a lot of vegetables piling up in the bin, give it a few days before you add anything else, because it means that they have too much food at the moment, and they need to eat what's there. If you see that food's disappearing every time that you go in the bin, that means you're probably not giving them enough food. So add a little bit more. And then also food, very important. Food should definitely go under the bedding. Don't leave it exposed, because that could attract fruit flies, and also it could create a bad smell that you don't want. Just like with outdoor composting, where you would put a brown to cap the top layer of the compost, you do the same for the worm compost. You want to put the moist bedding right on the bottom, and the worms kind of like a lasagna, and then on the top is where you have your dry bedding. So here, I don't know if you guys could see that. I have, as you could see, it looks like a little bit of soil there. That's the coconut coir mixed with the worms, then the food on top, and then on the very top is the dry material, which is the shredded up bills that I have. Yes, shred those bills if you don't need them. And then as far as feeding the worms, you could feed them every day, every couple of days, once a week. It really depends on you and how much you're looking to have that compost, and just caring for them properly. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Vanessa to tell you a little bit more of what to do with the compost.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. So the next thing that we're going to share with you is how to get the finished compost out of your compost bin. For some of you, the primary reason you might be interested in a worm bin is because you want to reduce your food waste. For others, it might be because you're really interested in making some compost for your garden. So I'll just give a second for our video to catch up so that I can show you how to move the material over. There we go. So with a little bit of planning in advance, it's very easy to harvest the compost from your worm bin. I will say, without a little bit of planning in advance, it is very difficult to get the compost out without also getting the worms out. You want to make sure to leave all your worms in the bin so that they can continue to eat the food scraps that you're feeding them, and so that you can continue to get more compost. So over time, I know it's a little bit, we're going to use our imagination because we're making do with what we have at home. But you saw in Claudia's bin that she had a layer of dark, rich material at the bottom for her. It's mostly coconut coir and a little bit of compost right now because her worm bin is pretty new. It's about 2 weeks, she said. But over time, you'll start to see a thick layer of finished compost. So a dark, rich material. Again, it's the worm poop in this case. So the worm poop is the magic in this story. And the worm poop will accumulate at the bottom. And then on top of the worm poop, you'll see whatever food you've been feeding them. And then on top of that, your layer of newspaper. What you're going to do when you're ready to harvest your bin is you're going to take your hand, or I guess you could use a plastic trowel or something. I wouldn't use a metal one. They'll take sharp. You don't want to injure your worms. But I like to use my hands, get to know the worms a little bit more. So you're just going to take your hand in your bin. You're going to take everything all the way down to the bottom, and you're going to swish it over into one half. Try and preserve the layers to the best extent. You're going to have a bare side of your bin now. And what you're going to do is start adding a layer of food scraps there with a new layer of newspaper. It can be dry newspaper in this case because your worm bin will be pretty moist and established by then. And what's going to happen is once the worms finish up whatever food scraps were here already, they're going to move over to the other side of the bin where you're adding fresh food scraps. Now this takes realistically a couple of weeks because even after the food scraps disappear on the side, the worms eat at a microscopic scale really. So they're still going to need a couple of little bits they're finishing up, and then they'll kind of move over, follow the food trail. What'll happen is that you'll have finished compost on one side with no worms, and you'll have a new set of compost and food scraps and newspaper and worms all working together on the other side. So once you start to see that happening, you can go ahead and harvest the compost, just take it out and use it as you'd like to. A couple of ways you might want to use your compost from your worm bin is if you are doing any planting at home. For example, if you're repotting your plants, I know that my plants have been getting maybe more love than they needed from me lately. You can mix it in with the potting soil when you repot them. You can also do what is called top dressing your plants, which means just adding a little bit of compost around the surface of your house plant. And just make sure if you're doing that you leave a little bit of a ring, a donut around the base of your plant because you don't want to build up the soil level around your plants. A lot of plants do some breathing through their stems. So again, it's just making a little ring around the top of your house plant if you're not ready to repot. And of course, you can use your worm compostings outside in your vegetable garden or flower garden, but typically worm bins, they don't make a lot of compost for using outdoors. However much food scraps you add into your bin, you're only going to get about a quarter of that volume of compost because worms, the water is evaporating, the worms are using them, and most of our food scraps are composed of water. So don't expect, you're not going to get a whole container full of compost right away, but you'll start to see a good buildup of compost over a couple of months, really. So I'm going to turn it back.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. So I think we're getting a lot of really great questions. So we want to just run through with you a bit of the typically asked troubleshooting questions that we've had. The first being, what should I do if my worm bin becomes smelly? That's one that is pretty often asked. So this usually means one of two things. It's either that there's something in the bin that the worms aren't eating fast enough, or the bin is becoming way too wet. So really with that, some food scraps have more of a natural odor, like broccoli stems or onion scraps, and you can avoid putting those in your bin in order to prevent that kind of smell. But if your bin becomes too soggy, then you can always just add more dry paper and then skip the very, very soggy foods until the conditions improve. So another one is, what if my worms try to leave the bin? I'm going to pass that over to Vanessa. I have my own solutions too, but.
Yeah, when your worms, especially if you get your worms in the mail or in a little container, they're going to be a little disoriented. They've probably been turned upside down a few times. So when you put them in the bin for the first time, again, they don't have eyes. They don't know which way is up and down. So they might try and leave the bin. So Claudia already mentioned a couple of days in a bright light helps them to find down again and keep within the bin. You just want to make sure also that they have adequate moisture and adequate food. Making sure they have food right away is going to keep them kind of in their space because they're also going to be a little bit hungry from their travels. If you do see a worm escape, don't fret, they can't get very far. It's not like you're going to find them in another part of your house. No, they're not going to make it. So if you just happen to see one that's on the lid of the bin or something like that, you can gently put it back in, tuck it in, make sure it has enough moisture, and hopefully they'll have learned a lesson about escaping their bin next time.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to questions because I know we saw a lot. We definitely want to make sure we get to them.
We have some great questions in the chat. The first one is, how many worms do you start with?
Great. I'll go ahead and answer that. So for the bin that I showed you, and just to make life easy, maybe I'll do like 2 or 3 questions and then we can switch to Claudia. So for the bin that I showed you, for this size bin, it's good to start with ½ pound to 1 pound of worms. Typically worms are either sold by the pound or in numbers. And so if ½ pound is about 500 worms, a pound is about 1,000. So that's how much you'll start with. And if you're ordering them online or through the Eastside Ecology Center, you will see that that's the same increments they use to sell their worms as well. Sorry, Amber, I think you might have been muted on that one.
Got you. Okay, great. The next question was, are you using regular tap water in the spray bottle? And also, what temperatures do they prefer in terms of the water?
Excellent. I am using tap water. There is some concern around chlorination of tap water. So many people will actually, what they'll do is they'll fill up a container with tap water, leave it out for a few days so that any of the chlorine can dissipate, and then use that to fill a spray bottle that they dedicate to their worms. You can use distilled water if you feel that's necessary. And regarding temperatures, I would say the appropriate temperatures are the ones that you're most comfortable at. But it has been studied that worms reproduce most often in the mid-70s.
Good to know. Another question that came up is, what about the worms that come from pet stores as feeders? Can you use those to start a worm bin?
Great. I'll answer this and then we'll give Claudia a chance to answer a couple of questions. So what you want to look for, I'm not sure what species are feeder worms, but you're looking for a species, it's called Eisenia fetida, and the common name is the red wiggler. On some websites, you might see something like red composting mix. That's okay too. But if you are going to a pet store and they have worms, you can ask them about the species and if they're suitable for composting. Again, the reason for choosing specific types of worms is because you want the worms that travel horizontally in the soil and eat organic matter or decomposing foodstuffs. And not every worm does that. So you want to make sure it's a composting worm, and in particular, the red wiggler, Eisenia fetida, is one which can do really well in a worm bin in a small space.
Great. The next question is, about how many cups of water are you adding to moisturize this first setup with the newspaper and the food scraps? Claudia, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sorry. I would say, I'm not sure, maybe Vanessa can provide an exact estimate. It really, if you just want to get it to be like a wrung out sponge, so like Vanessa kind of showed you guys, and maybe some of you that missed it, when you're using a spray bottle like this, you're just moistening it. You want to grab, once you start seeing that it's getting moist, you want to mix it in there. Then you want to grab the bedding, whether it's newspaper or white paper, and just squeeze it. And if it feels like a wrung out sponge, you've reached sort of the limit, because people like to use different amounts of bedding for their worm bins. So it's not like an exact recipe of how many cups of water you need. You could start with 1, I'm sure, and that would be, a good baseline for seeing how much you need. I think when I sprayed my worms, I maybe had used about a half of this spray, but I think I needed more too, because the coconut coir is different and it gets dry. So if you're starting out with paper, just, think of it as an art project. Just keep seeing and observing what works best and how much you need.
Another question about the coconut coir. So you place food scraps under the coconut coir or underneath the wet bedding, like at the very bottom?
Okay. Not at the very bottom. You can if you start out with, but either way, it's sort of going to get mixed in like a lasagna. So when you have your wet bedding there, then you can put the worms, then another like little layer of bedding, and then the food scraps. As long as the worms are sort of getting to the food scraps, and as long as your top layer is capped and the food isn't exposed and the worms aren't exposed, you should be fine if the food is at the bottom. But maybe think of it like a little bit of lasagna layering.
Are red wigglers different from the regular earthworms that we might find in a backyard outside space?
They are different. I think I'll let Vanessa take this one. She might know a few more facts, but those other worms, yes, it's a little bit different, especially because the red wigglers sort of live closer to the surface.
I see a couple of questions about worms, so I'll just agree that they are different. Again, it really has to do with what habitat they naturally live in and what they typically eat, because we definitely want worms that really love eating food waste in this case. And red wigglers they can exist in soils, but they're not nearly as common in soils, so that's why people typically order them. It's very difficult when you see a worm outside to actually know what kind of worm it is. They actually count you may have noticed that worms have like little lines on their body. So scientists actually count how many lines worms have to determine them from one another. So it's very tricky. So I would recommend, purchasing them from a reputable source where you know that you're going to get a composting worm. And just one more time about the number of worms for the bins that either Claudia or I showed you. You want to start with about half a pound to a pound of worms is good. If you double the size of that bin, which you absolutely can, you can start off with more worms proportionally. And just one thing you might have noticed is that both of our bins are pretty shallow. And again, that's because the worms, they travel horizontally in the soil horizon, not up and down. So if you wanted to double the size of your bin, you wouldn't make it twice as tall. In this case, for this style of bin, but you would make it twice as wide.
Thank you for covering a couple questions at once. A couple questions that also seem to go together to me anyway is, have you had instances of mold? And have you had, these are up in the chat, or have you had instances of flies? Someone has said, I don't feed my flies fruit, but my worms fruit, but I still get flies.
Sure. So in terms of mold, once in a while you might get something moldy. If you do see mold, the best thing you can do is just take it out of your bin and put it in your trash. It happens often with things like cantaloupe rinds. You might get that kind of white slimy mold in your bin. But mostly that will happen if your bin has too much food scraps. So if you see it, just remove it and be careful. Typically white molds are not that harmful to us, but if you notice any other color molds, just make sure you're not breathing it in or otherwise contaminating other surfaces in your household with it. Regarding fruit flies, some things you can do to control them is make sure your layer of newspaper is pretty adequate, because that'll help any new fruit flies from entering your bin and making eggs in there, and creating more fruit flies. If you do get a fruit fly issue, what you can do is make a little trap. You can look this one up online, but you cut a soda bottle in half and turn the top inside of it. You put a little layer of apple cider vinegar or a sweet juice with a drop of dish soap in it, and the flies kind of go in and they want to have the sweet liquid and they get stuck. So that is a little trick, but the best thing to do is to, of course, try and prevent getting fruit flies in the first place. You can follow those best practices that Claudia described about freezing your fruit peels, and keeping this pretty thick layer of bedding really helps to avoid that issue.
I'm just going to add to that, just because I had this problem, so I'm going to be sincere with you guys. Do not let your fruit fly problem get out of control. You want to tackle it immediately. As soon as you see 1 or 2 fruit flies, go to your bin and see if they're laying any eggs in there. If you see that there is any kind of, if you see that there's fruit flies coming out of there, you got a problem. So just take out any newspaper bedding that you see with their eggs or what could potentially be their eggs. There is a way to identify worm eggs. They do not look like fruit fly eggs. I would just recommend that, just use the measures that Vanessa recommended for preventative measures. But if you do see that, then definitely just address it right away. Don't wait a few days. If you see 1 or 2 fruit flies, just go in your bin and just check out if there might be some imbalance.
Great, thank you so much. And last 2 questions, I think, from the group. They're very different questions. Is this the same approach you would use in the ingredients of an outside composter? And finally, what are some cheap places to order worms online?
So indoor composting is completely different from outdoor composting. In your outdoor compost bin, you are usually adding some food scraps along with a lot of what we call browns, so things like leaves. It could be shredded newspaper as well. It could be wood chips or sawdust, so dry woody material. And in your outdoor bin, you're making sure to add at least twice as much of that brown material as your food scraps. In your worm bin, you don't have any need to add these browns. Your worms, they really prefer to eat the food scraps and they digest it very quickly. So it's a very different type of system. So you just want to make sure that you're not adding only food scraps to your outdoor bin and that you're not filling up your worm bin with wood chips or anything like that. Very different. And regarding, so we have ordered from Uncle Jim's wormfarm.com. I'm not sure if there are other vendors online that have different pricing or anything like that. You can check them out. Again, you can also ring the Lower East Side Ecology Center or send them an email, and they will be able to point you to some resources about worms as well.
All right, great. Thank you.
I also wanted to mention one more thing as far as getting the worms. I did order them recently. I think their prices went up because a lot of people are getting into indoor worm composting, which is cool. But for the worms itself, it was about $20. That didn't include, or that came with shipping as well. But I've also, when I used to do worm composting for an educational program, I did in New Jersey, I actually went to a fishing store and got the red wiggler worms from a fishing store. So I don't know how easily accessible that is to folks. They're actually even cheaper there. You just have to tell the person that you're looking specifically for red wiggler worms and maybe its Latin name as well, just to make sure that that's the correct variety that they gave you. But when I got those, that worked out fine in that bin. They lived for about, yeah, for almost a year.